On a chilly New Orleans street, an elder black saxophonist, once ostracized by the music world for his anti-racism stance, still performs nightly. One rainy evening he witnesses a young homeless man collapse from addiction. Without a second thought he intervenes, taking him to a rehab center and igniting a spark for change. 2 years later the young man returns, and what unfolds will deeply affect you. Before we delve into this narrative, let us know your viewing location. We value your engagement. He wasn't renowned, not anymore. In truth, he never truly had the chance. Yet as the New Orleans sky bled orange over Bourbon Street and the air carried whispers of stale liquor and faded regrets, a saxophone's soft lament echoed from the corner of Royal and Silence. It was his. Jeremiah J. Carter once graced polished stages, donned sharp suits and gleaming shoes, his fingers dancing across brass under warm lights. He played to packed houses, not mere bars, grand venues where music truly resonated amidst marble and velvet. His name, for a fleeting period, was spoken backstage with reverence. That boy's got something. And he did. But talent alone often falls short, especially when your skin is dark and your voice refuses to be silenced. Jay was never one to simply conform. He challenged club owners who skimmed wages, confronted white headliners who claimed his compositions, and spoke out when the city ignored violence outside stage doors. He didn't feign smiles or make deals with injustice masquerading as jazz. For this he paid a heavy price. It began with cancelled gigs, then rumors, difficult to work with, too political. The night that shattered him arrived during a sold-out show at the Old Crescent Theater. Jay was slated to be the final act, but he never played. Minutes before his set he was dismissed, no explanation, just security ushering him out. Later whispers circulated, fabricated stories of disciplinary issues, drug use, even aggression. All falsehoods, yet the kind that cling when a black man speaks truth in the wrong spaces. Within months, every door shut. Friends vanished, agents stopped returning calls, his apartment was lost, his record shelved, his name erased. So, like many broken individuals with music ingrained in their soul, he continued to play. Now, almost 30 years later, Jay stood beneath flickering streetlights, his saxophone battered, its brass the only voice he had left. His suit was secondhand, his shoes worn at the heels, his audience mostly indifferent passers-by. But when he played, it wasn't for them, not truly. He played for his former self, for the enforced silence, for the nights he nearly surrendered, for every note they tried to steal. The melody wasn't flashy or pleading, it was a testament. It recalled the faint drumbeat in a smoky lounge, the biting December chill as he slept under an overpass with only a saxophone case and a thin coat for warmth, the embrace of applause he hadn't heard in decades. People walked past him as if he were part of the concrete. Some tossed coins without a glance. A few offered polite nods, a silent acknowledgement of what a pity. Yet occasionally, just occasionally, someone paused. A woman with tear-filled eyes, a man clutching his chest, a teenager frozen mid-stride, overcome by an inexplicable feeling. Jay never spoke to them. He didn't need to. His music conveyed everything his voice once tried to express, but the world refused to hear. It soared above the sirens, the tourist clamor, the city's dull ache. It proclaimed, "I'm still here." And though no one inquired, though no one ever lingered, he played on, for silence had claimed too much already, and he wouldn't surrender his story. He was no longer on a stage, but perhaps in that quiet, weathered New Orleans corner, his music could still compel someone to stop and truly listen. He materialized from the shadows like a phantom, gaunt, drenched, stumbling as if gravity itself had turned against him. The rain had begun to fall in slow, harsh streaks, piercing through the neon glow of Bourbon Street. Most of the city had already retreated behind closed doors and drawn shutters. But the corner where Jeremiah J. Carter stood remained quiet, slick with water, illuminated only by a failing street lamp above and the fading echoes of a now silent song. Jay immediately noticed the boy, not because he was an anomaly here. Suffering wore many guises, but because of his eyes. They were vacant, unfocused, not observing the street, the sky, or even Jay. They were dull, as if the soul within was already departing, waiting only for the body to follow. He was young, early 20s at most, but life had already taken more than its due. Dirty blonde hair clung to his scalp, pale skin stretched taut over hollow cheeks, and an oversized sweatshirt clung to him like a wet shroud. Each step was a battle between muscle and collapse. Then abruptly his knees buckled. He crumpled to the pavement no more than 5 feet from Jay. Jay didn't hesitate. He gently set down his saxophone and moved to the boy's side, crouching low. The young man was trembling violently, every joint in his body shaking as if something internal sought escape. Withdrawal. Jay recognized it instantly. The tremors, the cold sweat, the confusion in his glassy stare. This wasn't a sickness that rest would cure. This was the kind that killed if ignored. Jay placed a hand lightly on the boy's shoulder, firm yet gentle, and watched him flinch, barely conscious. His lips parted as if to speak, but only a hoarse breath emerged. His body folded inward, arms clutching his stomach, face contorted in a silent scream. Jay reached into his coat and pulled out 2 folded bills. He placed them in the boy's shaking hands, gently closing his fingers around the money. Not much, but perhaps enough for food, enough for a minimal choice that didn't lead to death. Then he spoke. "What did you used to dream about, kid?" His voice was soft, steady, worn like old leather. "Whatever it was, don't let yourself die in someone else's dream." The words lingered in the rain like smoke from a dying fire. The boy didn't respond, but his breathing hitched once. His eyelids fluttered. For a moment his eyes met Jay's. Not in recognition, not even gratitude, but in something more primal, a flicker, a crack in the haze. Then he curled up at the base of a shuttered storefront, knees to chest, still shivering but his breath slowly finding a rhythm. Jay remained silent, watching, his own coat dripping onto the pavement. He expected no thanks, didn't need the boy's name. He only needed to know that tonight someone saw him. As the rain intensified and the night deepened its chill, Jay picked up his saxophone again, but he didn't play. Not this time. Tonight the silence spoke volumes. I could have walked away. Everyone else would have. But I didn't. Morning arrived in a muted, heavy silence, the kind that felt deliberate, as if the world had paused unnoticed. The rain had ceased hours ago, but the street remained slick with cold, oily puddles and shattered promises. Garbage bags slumped along the curb, windows stayed shut, and the city had yet to awaken. It was too early for tourists, too late for revelers, and far too quiet for compassion. Jay stood motionless, saxophone slung over his shoulder, his gaze fixed on the crumpled form exactly where he'd left him. Elliot hadn't moved. His body was half-curled, soaked through, one hand still clenched around the 2 bills Jay had given him. His breathing was shallow, his lips pale blue, and a fresh bruise bloomed on his cheek where he'd hit the pavement harder than either realized. A cigarette butt clung to his damp hoodie, his shoelaces untied. A rat scurried past indifferently. No one else even slowed. Jay watched him for a moment longer than necessary, long enough to feel the weight of the choice press against his ribs. He could leave, he'd already done more than most. Who would fault him? The boy didn't even know his name. But something in Jay's gut held firm, an ache he hadn't acknowledged since the day he'd been discarded from the Crescent Theater like living refuse. Without a word, Jay stepped away and returned a minute later with a battered metal cart he'd found behind the old corner bodega. 2 rusted wheels, a wobbly handle, and a crate lashed to the frame with duct tape. He carefully slid his saxophone inside, then grunted as he bent, lifting Elliot as gently as he could, cradling the boy's torso, his legs dragging like a puppet with cut strings. Jay was no young man. His back screamed before they made it to the first block. His knees protested with each crack in the pavement, but he pushed on. 10 blocks. 10 blocks through the morning chill, dirty puddles, and the sharp stares of people who wouldn't ask and wouldn't care. He didn't explain. He didn't stop. It was almost 8 a.m. when the gates of Second Note appeared. The old brownstone, once a jazz bar, was now a halfway home with music rooms instead of rehab wards. Faded posters of Coltrane and Ella still clung to the walls inside, like lingering memories. The front door creaked open before Jay even knocked. Clarence stood there, broad-shouldered, bald, his eyes bloodshot from too many late nights and too little hope. His hands were calloused, his spirit worn, but his presence still filled the doorway like an upright bass line. Jay hadn't seen him in months. Clarence looked down at the boy in the cart, then up at Jay. "You serious?" Jay nodded. "He needs somewhere." Clarence shook his head before Jay could say more. "We're full, man. Packed 5 beds to every 3 rooms. I had 2 OD cases just this week, 1 kid stabbed in the stairwell and a grant that dried up last month. Where exactly do you want me to put him?" In the drum closet, Jay's jaw clenched. Put him somewhere he won't die. Clarence folded his arms. You don't even know him. I don't need to. Jay's voice was quiet but it carried. I know that look. I wore it for a year and no one gave a damn. Clarence sighed deeply, annoyed, the kind of sigh only old friends can afford to share. This isn't the first stray you've brought here. Maybe not, but it's the first one that looked at me like he was already halfway gone and still listened. Clarence stepped aside. Jay wheeled Elliot inside. The air was warm, smelling of coffee, bleach and old vinyl. A Miles Davis record played softly in the background, barely a whisper. Jay carried Elliot upstairs with the help of a volunteer nurse who asked no questions. They laid him on a mattress without a frame, gave him a blanket and placed a plastic bucket nearby just in case. An hour later, Elliot opened his eyes. He didn't scream, but it was close. His whole body lurched, confused and furious, arms flailing against the blanket, mind clouded with panic and withdrawal. Where am I? What the— Get off me. He tried to rise, stumbled, almost knocked over the bucket. Jay stepped into the doorway without speaking. Elliot froze. Something about the old man's stillness, not threatening, not pitying, cut through the chaos. You brought me here? Elliot's voice was barely a whisper. Jay nodded once. I didn't ask for this. No, Jay said, but you didn't ask to die either. Elliot turned his face to the wall, breathing hard. His shoulders trembled and for a moment, Jay thought he might lash out again. Instead, Elliot muttered, You should have left me. Jay walked closer. Maybe, but I didn't. Elliot's voice cracked. Why? Jay crouched beside the bed, his knees popping. He didn't touch the boy, just looked at him like someone truly worth seeing. Because you haven't sung your song yet. Elliot blinked. What? You heard me. Jay's voice was calm but unwavering. You're too young to be done. Whatever's in you, it ain't finished. Elliot stared at him. He didn't cry, not yet. But his jaw twitched. His eyes flickered back and forth as if trying to decide which part of him was still allowed to believe that. Jay stood. Don't leave just because the world told you there's no room, he said quietly. That's a lie I believed once. Don't make it yours. He turned and walked toward the door. Elliot didn't move, but when Jay reached the hallway he heard it. Not a word, just the sound of breathing, deeper now, slower, like a man who didn't know what came next but had at last decided not to flee from it. Jay didn't smile, but his hand, resting on the banister, stopped shaking. 2 years later, the boy who once trembled on a rain-soaked sidewalk stood in the sunlight. The transformation wasn't miraculous. It was a slow, grinding rhythm, imperfect, offbeat, full of errors, but building toward something genuine. 2 years since the night Jay pushed Elliot 10 city blocks in a rattling cart with rusted wheels, and the kid who once looked like a corpse now stood tall enough to meet Jay's eyes without flinching. Second Note hadn't changed much, but Elliot had. The old jazz bar still bore cracked bricks and water-stained ceilings. The stairs still groaned in protest with every step. But the light now fell differently. Perhaps it was the season, or perhaps it was because Elliot had learned to open the windows each morning, letting in the air, even on days when every fiber of his being screamed to stay shut tight. He no longer slept through sunrise. He welcomed it, even if some mornings it took him a while to stand. Clarence had once told Jay, half joking, that he didn't expect Elliot to last a week in that place. Too brittle, he'd said, too much fire under all that ash. But now Clarence watched the same kid lead group therapy circles with a quiet composure that surprised even the oldest residents. He listened to Elliot speak with that rough, lived-in voice that didn't claim omniscience but certainly knew something about survival. He's got it, Clarence had finally conceded to Jay over late-night coffee. Whatever it is. Elliot's journal was now worn, its edges frayed, ink bleeding where rain had once seeped through his coat. He still wrote daily, first thing in the morning, last thing before sleep. Some entries were barely legible. Others were so raw they bled through the paper. Most were for his eyes only. But buried amidst sketches and scribbles were moments of clarity like this. I used to be a walking corpse. Now I'm learning how to breathe again. He read that line aloud once in a Sunday reflection circle. It wasn't planned, it just slipped out, but it hung in the air long after the words left his lips. A woman across from him, 40, covered in prison tattoos, her voice like gravel, looked at him with brimming eyes and whispered, "That's what I feel like. A breath I haven't taken yet." Elliot didn't respond, just nodded. From that day forward, more people attended the circle. Jay visited every Tuesday, rain or shine. He never stayed long, never hovered, but he was always there, sitting in the same chair by the music room window. Sometimes he brought books, old paperbacks from defunct libraries. Sometimes he brought vinyl records Elliot had never heard of, and they'd sit together letting the music speak. But most of the time Jay just listened. Elliot told him everything. The hard days, the better ones, the dreams that terrified him more than the nightmares. Jay never judged, just nodded, sometimes murmuring, "Good, keep going." One day, Jay brought something different. A stack of tattered textbooks wrapped in a worn grocery bag: psychology, social work, human behavior, a community college's leftover donation. Jay said little, just handed them to Elliot and said, "Read what you can. Don't let your brain fall asleep." Elliot didn't just read, he devoured them. He took notes, asked questions, watched online lectures in the shared computer room, begged Clarence to quiz him with flashcards, and signed up for GD prep classes at night. He failed a few practice tests but passed the real thing on his second try. The day the certificate arrived in the mail, he stared at it for 20 minutes before speaking. "I think I want to keep going." Clarence raised an eyebrow. "Keep going where?" "School," Elliot said. "College. I want to study psychology. Not just survive. I want to help people the way you helped me, the way he nodded toward the hallway where Jay's footsteps had just faded, "saw me before I even existed." A week later, Elliot registered for classes at the local community college, paying the first month with savings from cleaning work he did around Second Note and a small grant Clarence helped him apply for. 3 mornings a week he caught the 6:45 a.m. bus with a second-hand backpack, peanut butter sandwiches, and an old laptop that whirred like a dying trumpet when it booted. He sat in the front row of every class, spoke only when he had something valuable to say, and took notes as if every word mattered because to him it did. Between school and meetings, Elliot started something unexpected. At first, it was just a few people from his old group who wanted to continue talking even after treatment. So he found an empty room in the old rec center 2 blocks from Second Note, scrounged together some chairs and printed flyers at the college library. At the top of every flyer he wrote one sentence in bold: "Don't die in someone else's dream." That was the name, the entire purpose. The first meeting had 4 people. A girl who slept in her car, a trans kid kicked out by their parents, a young man who hadn't spoken in days, and Elliot. He didn't lecture or quote textbooks. He handed out cheap notebooks and said, "Write, draw, hum if you want. No one's judging." Someone brought a guitar the next week. Someone else read a poem. Eventually they came not out of obligation but because for the first time in a long time they wanted to. One night, Jay arrived early at Second Note and found the place nearly empty. Clarence pointed down the block. "You might want to go see your boy." Jay followed the sounds of laughter and music to the rec center, peering through the glass door. Elliot stood at the front of the room, sleeves rolled up, notebook in hand, listening to a girl nervously read lyrics she'd written about her mother. Elliot's face was calm, but his eyes were alive, patient, open, present. Jay didn't step inside. He just stood there for a while, watching, listening, then slowly turned and walked back into the night, the faintest smile touching the corner of his mouth. Because in that moment he understood. The boy wasn't just surviving anymore. He was building something brick by brick, soul by soul, and he was doing it in his own voice. Not every star burns brightly across the sky. Some simply glow long enough to warm a single soul, and that's enough to light a universe. The theater was packed. Not the polite, curated kind of full with black ties and neatly tucked playbills and velvet seats, but a vibrant, breathing fullness. People stood shoulder to shoulder, buzzing with stories of bruises, of survival. The air was thick with anticipation, warm with breath and possibility. Some wore second-hand suits, some still bore the weary lines of shelter nights and recovery rooms, but every face held something rare: recognition, gratitude, hope. This was Elliot's night. The stage lights hummed above him as he emerged from behind the curtain. No fanfare, just footsteps, slow, steady. He stood at center stage in a dark shirt with rolled sleeves, a single piece of paper in his hand, though he barely glanced at it. His voice didn't boom, it didn't need to. It landed like rain after a drought, quiet, essential and real. "I was supposed to die," he began. "And I almost did, twice, maybe 3 times. Depends how you count. But someone saw me. Really saw me when no one else even looked. A murmur rippled through the room. Elliot took a breath. I don't know why he stopped. Maybe it was mercy. Maybe madness. But whatever it was, it saved me. He paused. No one moved. There was a man who stood on the corner of Bourbon Street. Old, quiet, played saxophone like it was the last truth anyone had left to offer. He didn't ask for anything. He never sought credit. But he gave me a moment. Just one. A few dollars, a few words, and a reason. He turned toward the wings for a heartbeat. The entire theater seemed suspended in air. And tonight he's here. The lights dimmed. A single spotlight found the edge of the stage and slowly, deliberately, Jay stepped into it. He moved like a man shaped by years in silence. Each step deliberate, each breath drawn from somewhere deep. His suit was clean but modest, his shoes shone dully under the lights, and his saxophone, cradled in both hands, caught the glow as if it still recalled the sound of applause. The room fell silent. Even the air seemed to still. Jay said nothing. He looked out over the crowd, not with fear, not with pride, but with the quiet disbelief of someone who'd spent a lifetime unseen and was now for a moment standing in the light. Then he lifted the horn to his lips and began to play. The first note of First Breath Again was soft, fragile, like a whisper after too long a silence. Then came the second, stronger, warmer, shaped by something deeper than memory. The melody didn't demand, it invited. It welcomed the room into something sacred. It wasn't a perfect performance. His hands trembled once, a note caught in his breath. But none of it mattered because what the audience heard wasn't just music. It was a story etched in brass and breath. A story of survival, of second chances, of what it means to be truly seen. Somewhere in the back row, a woman wept quietly. A young man gripped the arm of the person beside him. Clarence stood by the side aisle with his arms folded, blinking too frequently to be casual. Elliot watched from the wing, eyes wide, heart pounding with something that wasn't nerves. It was reverence. When Jay finished, he slowly lowered the saxophone, his eyes glistening under the stage lights. For a moment no one moved. Then someone stood. Another, then another. The entire room rose in a slow, swelling wave of applause. Not thunderous, but steady, honest. A standing ovation not for spectacle but for truth. Jay didn't bow. He just smiled gently, like a man who had finally heard the note he'd been chasing his whole life and knew it had been worth the wait. And in the quiet before he turned to leave the stage, a tear slipped down his cheek. The clip hit the internet that same night. A teenager in the audience filmed it on a shaky phone camera and uploaded it with the caption, "This man saved a life with music." Within days it garnered millions of views. TikTok, Reddit, Facebook. Every platform lit up with hashtags. Hashtag JSaxman, hashtag help when you can, hashtag don't die in someone else's dream. People shared stories. Stories about strangers who changed their lives, moments they almost surrendered, songs that pulled them back from the brink. Music teachers, bus drivers, grandparents, forgotten mentors, the invisible helpers. And at the center of it all was one man who never asked to be remembered but now couldn't be forgotten. Weeks later, Elliot received letters from across the country. Donations poured in for Second Note and other recovery centers. A music school offered Jay an honorary guest position. He politely declined, smiling. "I've already played the best room I'll ever know," he said. And he had, because it wasn't just about the music. It was about the moment. The moment when a boy thought he had nothing left, and an old man gave him one reason to keep breathing. The final shot fades in. Jay sitting on a bench just outside Second Note. Saxophone resting beside him, eyes closed, face tilted to the sun. Then quietly, a message appears on screen. If you still have the strength to help someone, don't hesitate. A single act of kindness can save a life. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.